Thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Laura Eise. I am the Director of Security Strategy and Analytics at Expedia Group. Expedia Group is a brand conglomerate, a travel company with brands such as Expedia.com, Hotels.com, car rentals, etc. I've been in this position for about 2 years, but I've been working in cybersecurity for over a decade, primarily building and managing cybersecurity programs. I am super excited to be here. I have actually, in the past and actually at the moment, have had teams that were all women, which is pretty unusual in our field. So it's definitely been something I'm pretty thrilled about. Some of my interests outside of work include cyber safety for children and mental health across all demographics. Today I'm talking about emotional intelligence, which is something I've learned about throughout my career, but a little bit more specifically at Georgetown University when I did their leadership coaching program. And also, this was a while ago at this point, but when I had my undergrad in psychology.
Well, we are excited you're with us today.
Thank you.
So we have your slides pulled up. Just say next slide and take it away. The floor is all yours.
All right, sounds good. So you can probably go to the next slide. Thank you. All right. So I have a couple of little activities that I'd love it if you feel like participating in as I go through this presentation. If we had a live chat feature, I would have you type it in. But since we don't for this call, if you want to maybe jot down some notes on a notepad, or if you have a Word doc or something you want to put it in, if you feel like participating. So here we are at the beginning. So emotional intelligence is a phrase that's tossed around a lot, and it can even feel a little buzzwordy. So I wanted to just start the presentation by agreeing on what it means. So emotional intelligence is most often defined as the ability to perceive, use, understand, manage, and handle emotions. So on this first slide, we have some eggs that are feeling some emotions, and I drew some hair on them so they look a little bit more like women. Not that you have to have long hair as a woman. So what I'd like you to do is just take a moment to pause, and we can flex our emotional intelligence a little bit. What egg do you feel like the most right now? So I feel, let's see, a little bit like the first egg, I think, and a little bit like the third egg. So I'm excited to be here, but also a little bit nervous. I might even say I'm a little bit of the fifth egg with those little bags under her eyes. A little bit tired, but Monday. So if you've had a chance to check in with how you're feeling, let's move into the rest of the presentation and see how we can actually use these feelings to help us with our well-being overall, and by improving our well-being, improving the well-being of those around us, our teams, our organizations, our friends, families, and whatnot. So if you could go to the next slide. All right, so today I have three topics that I will touch on and how emotional intelligence impacts those. So the first is leading in organizations and how emotional intelligence can help us in this aspect. The second is I want to talk about emotional intelligence under traumatic conditions, which I believe we are all living under. And then finally, how we can use emotional intelligence to champion social justice at our workplaces. And so I mentioned on the previous slide that I want this discussion to be about your well-being. I think a lot of the times when we have these conversations, it's about how can we make everybody else around us feel better or work better or improve their performance. And I'd love to, as women, take a moment for us to actually think about how we can make our lives better. So by fostering some joy, peace, and fulfillment in our lives, how we can then, improve and hopefully inspire those around us. And before I go to the next slide, I always remind myself that this is a journey, and so we will absolutely not always get it right, and who even knows what right means. Okay, so next slide. All right, so this section, leading in organizations. So some of us probably have titles that are very clearly like leadership roles. So I'm a director. It's not like I'm probably a leader. Maybe you're not. Maybe your role as an individual contributor, just a team member, you'd like to be a manager, maybe you're way up in the food chain, if you will. But we can guide and inspire others in any role. So this should apply to everybody. What I do want to say, though, is just because you can guide and inspire others in any role doesn't mean that you should not ask for what you deserve. So if you want to be in a leadership position and you're not, I absolutely 100% encourage you to go for it. All right, so next slide. All right, so emotional intelligence, as defined by Goldman, who studied this actually in the 90s. It's still, his 7 competencies of emotional intelligence are still considered, what most people would define as emotional intelligence, the competencies. So here I have another little exercise that I'd love for you to participate in if you feel up to it. So as we touch on each of these competencies, I'd love it if you could think about which area you are doing well in and where you would like to grow, because we can absolutely improve our emotional intelligence through practice. So the first one is getting along well with others. So seems pretty obvious. The people with high emotional intelligence are active listeners, and this one I think is really important. They are truly curious. So they ask questions, they're comfortable talking to strangers, they're adept at reading people. And so if this is an area you're not comfortable in, you could consider practicing it. So the next time you go to a grocery store, challenge yourself to ask a question of the person who's checking you out. Or try a couple of different, I know we're not flying as much these days, but if you take a flight, consider initiating a conversation with the person sitting next to you. These little goals or targets are ways to help improve or strengthen this muscle. So the next one is self-awareness of strengths and weaknesses. So part of this is just being self-confident, and I know that can be particularly challenging for women with imposter syndrome and the need or feeling like, because we get often spoken over, or perhaps our ideas are like adopted or appropriated somebody else, that it can feel like there actually is, like, we don't have like ground to stand on to be confident in our work. However, just remember you wouldn't be where you were if you didn't deserve it. Although we do get lucky, but absolutely, I'd say in most cases the women in their roles deserve it and have worked very hard to get there. But the self-confidence also comes with being open to a negative evaluation, and so actively seeking out feedback. So maybe reflect on when was the last time you've asked for feedback from somebody on your team, your boss, somebody who works for you. That might be something you could challenge yourself to do to grow in this space. Next is operating with integrity. So here, some of the keywords are trustworthiness and conscientiousness. I would touch on this here. This has to do somewhat with gossip. So if you find it's easy to fall into gossip or to talk about others when they're not in the Zoom call or in the room, you're going to be viewed by others as untrustworthy, because if you're gossiping about somebody, most people will assume you'll gossip about them too. So these are just a few things to be aware of in this space. All right, so the next one, self-awareness of feelings. This is an area I think I could do better in, but emotionally intelligent people have self-control when it comes to their feelings, particularly anger or frustration. So I will, in a few slides, talk a little bit more about how to handle the amygdala hijack or when we get triggered. And this is often when anger or frustration can show up in ways that we don't want it to. Present focused, instead of whining or complaining about what's happening, coming up with a solution. What can you do to move forward? That's not to say that complaining is bad. Sometimes it's good to vent, but if you vent too much, you really can focus on the problem and just get mired down in the negative feelings. Self-motivation. You are committed to reaching the goals of your group, and you're willing to take opportunities that might be outside of your scope, or to keep pushing forward on a project despite setbacks or obstacles. And finally, well-placed boundaries. So individuals with high EQ are skilled at assessing what is realistic in terms of time and energy. So if you're not necessarily skilled at gauging how much time and activity will take, you might want to, for example, consider a challenge of when you get a request, asking instead of committing to it immediately, saying, give me 24 hours to get back to you, or let's check in with my boss, and things like that, just to make sure you can take the time to evaluate. All right, so if you can move to the next slide. So I'm going to move quickly through these next few slides since there is a lot of content and not a lot of time. So in general, what we are using or trying to do when it comes to emotional intelligence is shift both ourselves, our personal journey, but also the systems within which we operate. And so on the left-hand side, you see what is like can be a typical or traditional way of operating, where you are focusing on dependency and control. So characteristics of this would include, like, there's only one right way, either or thinking, denial, defensiveness. This one can be a little tricky this one's a little tricky for me, but the right to comfort. We don't actually have a right to be comforted when we feel like, as long as we're not unsafe, if something is happening to us, it's okay to sit in that discomfort. Quantity over quality and urgency. And so this space looks a lot like fear. What we'd like to do by using our emotional intelligence is shift to one of empowerment and self-management, where we can influence and loosen the hold of control. All right, next slide. So most of you have probably heard of the fundamental attribution error. If you haven't, it's a cognitive bias that causes you to over-assign the causality to a person's personality. And so that means if somebody is rude to you or dismissive or misses a meeting, you would assume that it is because this person doesn't like you, doesn't respect you, doesn't want to participate in your project or help move the mission forward. And oftentimes this is not the case. And so just keep an eye on the next time you might get frustrated or upset about someone's behavior. Think about try to reflect on their behavior over the long term, and if this is actually because of their personality or something like inherently negative within them, or if it might just be a bad day, for example. All right, next slide. Just a few additional areas for you to consider when it comes to emotional intelligence. There's personal competence and social competence. So keeping an eye out how you build and develop your self-awareness and self-management, but also how you do it in a group. Next slide. All right, so here you might be wondering, we've taken a few minutes to go over what is emotional intelligence, but why does it matter so much? So there's been some research in this space about leadership and what matters most to people in leadership. And it really does come down to emotional intelligence. It's twice the other two areas we have here, IQ and technical skills. And so while it is important that you have the technical skills to be in your position, it is actually not as important as the emotional intelligence you bring to the role. On the next slide, we can see a different view. So here is what contributes to a leader's success. And so you have in purple everything else. So that could be connections, opportunity, even location. And then on the other side, you have, as you see, emotional intelligence as a big chunk of what actually you have within your power. Next slide. So I apologize for the graphic here. It's a little blurry, but it is the best view I found about what happens when you have an amygdala hijack. So as I referenced before, I wanted to touch on what can happen when we get triggered at work. And so when we are, like, you know, sitting in a meeting in a room, we're getting sensory data. So we're hearing the voices, we're smelling things, maybe the room's hot and it's like, we're sweating. It's all the sensory data that's feeding to our thalamus. And that data gets sent to the amygdala. So the amygdala is where the threat assessment. And all this data is also sent to the cortex. The amygdala actually can block what is considered the slow thinking, which is the more intentional thinking that occurs in our cortex. And when the amygdala blocks the flow of thinking, that's when we have our unthinking response. And that's when what you might have heard it in different various phrases, but in this case, I've been calling it being triggered or having an amygdala hijack. So if we go to the next slide, I'll explain that a little bit more. All right, so your unthinking response, or the hijack, is when three things happen. It's a decrease in working memory. A bunch of chemicals are released into our bloodstream. So that might be when you just feel your body tense up. You feel like maybe you feel hot. I think you can experience it in several different ways. So the next time you have a hijack, you might want to pay attention to what's happening in your body. Or you might have to, reflect on it afterwards, since you probably are not doing any intentional thinking in the moment. And over time with multiple hijacks, the neurons begin to erode and you begin to build pathways that will reinforce that trigger, which is why it's important to be aware of what our triggers are so we can respond as much as we can in the moment. So if you go to the next slide, I'll go over a few additional characteristics of a hijack. So here I have another activity for you. This one I know can be a little bit challenging. So if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed today, feel free to skip this activity. But something to think about is what triggers a hijack for you. So for me, it can be loud voices or yelling, particularly men. Because the way I was raised, I had a father who was oftentimes very angry, and he would yell and he would hit things, and it was really scary for a little person. And so today I'm better at it, but still, if there's a meeting where people get heated and their voices are raised, I can just feel my body seize up. And so I feel these characteristics. I feel like I have no control. It just feels to come on very quickly. And the last one where it says it takes you someplace other than where you planned. So maybe I show up for that meeting and I plan to, present my ideas on XYZ. And when I'm hijacked, I can't. What comes out might come out completely differently. Or I might say nothing at all. Oftentimes, in my case, I say nothing at all because I'll freeze. We will look a little bit more further in the presentation though at what your response might be in these situations. So next slide. Again, I'm sure many of you have heard about mindfulness practices, but this is an excellent way to help reduce the impact of triggers and hijacks over the long term. So, and here I just want to point out, even a little counts. You don't need to go to a weekend retreat or a 10-day retreat of complete silence. You could do 5 minutes of meditation a day. At the moment, I'm actually struggling to do even that. So what I do is when I go for a walk or a jog, I try to notice just one or two things around me. And I will say, since doing this, particularly in autumn in Seattle, I had no idea there were so many apples in my neighborhood, so many apple trees. So try to think about a mindfulness activity that might work for you to be a little bit more in the moment. So on the next slide, we have a few more examples of what you can do to reduce the impact of a hijack. So deep breaths, pretty obvious, but important to like actively practice, because in the moment, like we discussed, you're not going to be like, oh, let me think about this presentation on emotional intelligence on Monday. Actually, appreciation can really offset these feelings as well. So if you can think of something you're grateful for, so even something small like your hot coffee in the morning or like your fuzzy blanket. And then something else you can do is like actively use your conscious thinking brain, the cortex, to seek additional information about what might be happening. So you can check in with somebody else. You can look up some additional information. It might help you validate your experiences or to take a different perspective. All right, next slide. All right, so I'm going to move through these quickly because I want us to get to the rest of the presentation. So a few more things for you to think about when you run into triggers or setbacks. This is, again, trying to move from a dependency mindset to an empowered mindset. So how do you rationalize your setback? So do you think it was personal? Do you think it happens consistently, or was it just one time? And was it permanent or something that you can do or can be changed or done in a different way with a conversation or with changed behavior? Next slide. Again, here, think about the locus of control, which is when you look at the world, how do you see it? Do you see it controlling you, or do you see your ability to take action on what is surrounding you? So if you feel like you have an impact on the world, it's a much healthier place to exist in and can lead to greater optimism, which has multiple benefits for you, for your organization, and for those around you. If you feel like your locus of control is external, so all the things around you are happening to you, that can lead to a lot of the challenges and the more negative thinking. Next slide. All right, so I could go on a great deal about speech acts, but something to be aware of when you are using language is that it is easy to be thrown away in the language we use, especially, it can feel tiring to constantly be paying attention to, are you using the right phrase? I know we're all trying to shift away from saying you guys, so maybe you've adopted the y'all perspective. But language really does create action. And so when you are communicating with somebody, you might want to pause to think about what speech act are you using? Are you making an assertion, which can be empirically verified to be true or false? Are you making an assessment? So that might convey your feelings, beliefs, opinions. Are you making a declaration? Are you making a request, an offer, or an agreement? And so what I do want to point out here is that when you are asking for a raise, for example, I've seen this happen a number of times with the women I work with, and I know I do it too. Think about if you're making a request when you ask for a raise, for example, because what you might be doing is offering or making a declaration, and it is much harder to take action or for the person hearing it to understand what you are asking and the request you are making of them if you make it in with a different speech act, because in fact, if you don't make a request, you're not asking them to do anything. So just pay attention to that in the future, something I will pay attention to as well. All right, so the last slide of this section. Next slide, thank you. So weary of the promise of an oasis, we defend the merits of the desert. So I'll just leave this slide with just one statement. Sometimes the best choice is to move on. All right, next slide. All right, So just a few, I'll have to just touch on a few highlights here. My presentation is much too long. So as I mentioned, traumatic conditions, we live in distressing times. And not only do we live in distressing times, I do believe that even before the pandemic, many, if not all of us, have either experienced traumatic conditions or traumatic events. Whether it's sexual abuse or emotional abuse, even something like a car accident, there are many, or the news, simply the news happening, who our politicians are, can all create environments that are very traumatic. So I'd like to just touch on a few things to pay attention to in these distressing times. So next slide. All right, so before I jump into a little bit of this content, I did want to let you know who developed it. So this is developed by Teddy McLean Wright and Tristan Harris Talley of In the Works in partnership with Leslie Briner of Social Strategies. Next slide. All right, so what I'll touch on over the next minute or two are four main ideas. So these are areas or ideas that should be inherent to all of us. So safety, being physically, psychologically, and emotionally secure. Agency, the ability to make a decision, experience a reasonable consequence of that decision, and make another. Dignity, the sense of one's place and power in the world. And belonging, or the expression of being connected, a full member of a group. In this case, potentially you'll be thinking about your workplace. Next slide. So when we are born, we begin full. So we have safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. We have the capacity to have adventures, make mistakes, learn, take risks, and we can experience the fullness of life. Next slide. So when we encounter hardships, some of these begin to fracture, and we begin to believe that these notions are not our birthright, and we begin trading one for the other, potentially. So you might decide that you will compromise your dignity to belong. Next slide. And as the traumatic conditions continue, you might see the world as an inherently threatening place. And so this is oftentimes where we see a lot of oppression or marginalization, is when others experiencing traumatic conditions try to take them away from others as a coping mechanism. Next slide. And if these conditions continue, you begin to become keyed for threat detection. And what I wanted to do as a quick exercise, if you feel like jotting down some notes here, our emotional and sensation ranges compress, and everyday experiences become intolerable. So as you think about these last couple of years, or perhaps earlier in your life, have you ever had a time of your life where you felt like your everyday experiences were intolerable? And I can say that over the last year or two, there were days where I felt like if I had one more Zoom call, I would just break. I was like, I just cannot do it. Next slide. So I will wrap up here and just touch on how we can absolutely rebuild from these experiences using the emotional intelligence that characteristics we discussed above, but also by being very careful and cognizant of how we take care of ourselves. So the last question I have for you is to think about some things you do regularly, randomly, or ritually to tend to your relative well-being. And just a note here, it's not well tending if we return with the same resources we left with. That's considered coping. So earlier in the pandemic, for example, I definitely drank more wine than I probably should have. And while in some ways it was tending to my well-being because it was some like downtime, some peace, was able to read a book, check out, it also, I would have a hangover or I wouldn't sleep as well. And so I was not returning with the additional resources from that well tending. So just something to pay attention to. And with that, I will wrap up my presentation and turn it over for Q&A.
Well, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. It definitely gave me a lot of things to think about. So, as
was so
good,
long
good and bad. So I'm going to ask now if anybody would like to ask a live question. So if you have dialed into the presentation and you would like to ask a live question, you can hit 5* and I can unmute you and you can ask us a live question. So, but as we're waiting for somebody to ask a live question, I'm going to go to first one of our questions that has come in from the chat. So this first question came from Alexandra. And Alexandra said, any way to avoid the hijacking when you see it coming? During the day, I work in a true office environment.
Oh, that's a great question. So, when you say you work in a true office environment, that what I'm like taking away from that means that maybe you're in like kind of a more like old school, like show up, do your job, 9 to 5. I'm not sure if that's what you meant, which is unfortunate because we're actually, I feel like, starting to see some changes in the workplace where if we are overwhelmed, it's okay to say, I'm going to go take a walk. Or, I'm going to, it's a little bit easier, like when you're in Zoom, to be like, I have a break between meetings. I'm going to go to the gym. I just need to work off some energy. And so I don't know if that's possible in your workplace, especially it can be challenging as a woman to try to lead that charge because so often assumed to be very emotional. And so it's like, oh, you can't handle it. When in reality, it's actually very powerful to tend to your well-being. So I don't know if it's even possible at all to try to avoid those situations, or if you can to just be open about I need to step away or take a break. Again, not knowing what your environment is, I'm not sure if this is helpful advice, but I do think that sounds really challenging.
Yes, thank you. And Alexandra said to follow up, she said you had spoken about how to start your day, but sometimes I see these hijacks coming in the middle of the day when I'm just sitting in my desk.
Oh, well, I will say I don't know if it's possible to do some deep, honestly, just to go back to just the deep breathing, if it's possible to do that. And there's the little meditation you can do sitting, you can do with your eyes open. It's called a spiral meditation, where you just imagine kind of air moving up in a spiral up around your body. And you can do it, you can pretend you're still working and potentially do it at the same time. And sometimes the answer is not just trying to meet it head on, but it's actually to distract ourselves. So if there's a different, it's not always a bad thing to focus your attention elsewhere to try to calm down, to self-soothe. So if you see a trigger coming at you, or you're feeling yourself getting triggered, maybe take a quick break and look on Amazon for, your next pair of slippers, cat or bunny slippers, and my case rabbit.
That's wonderful advice. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, so this next question came from Linda, and I'm reading it live. So this says, can you say more, when you're speaking of rebuilding, about how to reestablish favorable conditions? Does this have to do with getting in touch with your inner motivations and desires and looking around for you can get replanted? What about when you're staying in the same environment and some of the same triggers can be unavoidable?
So this is actually a really hard one because it is really, really hard to recover from traumatic experiences if you are still in the traumatic conditions. And so I think the well tending can help, but the true path to like whole recovery is actually trying to shift those conditions, which I know that it can be really painful. That can be very painful to kind of accept or look at, and something I've had to think about several times when I felt like I had no other option, because oftentimes we feel like we cannot quit our jobs, because if we quit, what if we don't have any money? What if we have no place to live? Like, it's very catastrophic the way that, like, in a capitalistic society of, like, if you don't have a job, like, you feel like your entire well-being is threatened. So I don't know if it's possible to think a little bit longer term and brainstorm for yourself what could be a plan B to remove yourself from that. So I have two plan Bs that I have in my back burner, which is I'd love to potentially become a therapist, or I'd love to become a park ranger. So to become, an expert on bear tracking, for example. And those sound like maybe I say it like goofy, like a little pie in the sky, but actually, like, I have looked at how could I do those things, and take some time to consider if actually you might want to shift to Plan B at some point, because your well-being is the most important.
Well, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. I know we're getting to time for this afternoon. So I know I could keep asking more and more questions. So as we move on to our next presentation, do you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom for all our listeners today?
Oh, gosh. Okay. Let me read a quote to you from Burnout by Emily and Amelia Nagoski. So, to do well is not to live in a state of perpetual safety and calm, but to move fluidly from a state of adversity, risk, adventure, or excitement back to calm, out again. And so it's okay to have some ups and downs, throw yourself into something, try some well-being, try some self-tending, see if it works, and maybe it won't. And that's okay. So I can tell you a couple of years ago, I never thought I would be an avid video game player, but over the pandemic, it has been a great way for me to do my well-tending. So I'm bummed that I made my presentation too long, because I really wanted to touch on some social justice at the workplace. But I will say that as women, we are undervalued in our society, which gives us the ability, though, to see and empathize with other social identities, like race and ethnicity, socioeconomic class, how they might be undervalued too. So as much as you have the capacity, see how you yourself can be, can like lift up those around you and be like a social justice champion.
Well, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thank you.